everyone, welcome back to Bridging the Gap, Season 2. We've had a lot of people ask us if we're going to continue on with this endeavor, and we've had a gap in time between our last installment of our first season and this one. And so we're going to talk about that. Yes, we're doing it. This is our Season 2. Hopefully my edits are better and our conversation's even better and more relevant for you guys. Dad, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what constitutes a season.
Whatever we say.
We have 4 broadcasts, 3, whatever, gap in time. So kind of funny we call it Season 2. It's like watching All Creatures or one of the PBS seasons. I keep waiting for the next season. So anyway, Season 2.
But here we are. We like to keep you on your toes, so you never know how long these season's going to be. But we hope to bring these to you more consistently and something that you can kind of know is coming. So with that being said, where have we been? So we've had a lot of changes. You notice the scenery background change. So we are recording this in my house. Many of you who follow me know that my husband and I are now living with our in-laws. They've moved from Idaho to here in Davis County, and we are one big happy family. So we've got my husband's parents here and then our family, of course, and we've been blessed to build a home that will kind of allow us to navigate that space as we live communally. And it's been a blessing, but it's definitely been challenging. And so that has occupied a lot of my mind this past summer and early spring as we closed on this house, got in, finished with the rental, did all the cleaning, and as you know, moving can be quite the experience. So you think you're done with something and you're not done. And then you realize you have so much stuff. We accumulate a lot of baggage, physically and spiritually in life. But we had a lot of stuff that we're still trying to get rid of. But we're here now, so I'm really excited about that, and I am starting to feel like this is home. Start of school, those of you that have children, that's always kind of stressful, and it brings on extracurricular activities. We're involved in that too, so we're busy. And on top of that, I think with those stressors, my father and I had a conversation, about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? Maybe a little longer.
It was before we went to Oregon, so yeah, it's at least a month.
Okay. Where we addressed the fact that we had kind of allowed some space to go by because of some tension that was existing. I don't know if you were aware of it as much as I was or vice versa, but we had stopped these dialogues and we also weren't dialoguing as much on our own. And part of the reason for that is, I think, some misunderstanding of communication between us and some hurt feelings. When you have these conversations, as we've mentioned before, emotions get high. You talk about religion, you talk about your experience with the church, your testimony, your lack of testimony, all those things that bring in emotions, and when some things are said, they can be said in a way that's not helpful. And perhaps you being the one who said it weren't aware that it impacted another person. And so we definitely realized we let too much time go by before we addressed some of those things that maybe were misunderstood or said in a way that was hurtful to the other. And also concerns. I had mentioned to my father, I have concerns. I don't want to hurt his feelings, but I want to be authentic as I talk to you about some of my current thoughts on things. I always want to call my dad. When something happens in the church or I'm noticing a trend in the community, how it relates to the church, and sometimes I hold back because I don't want to get you upset, because maybe my experience with that situation is not like your own, and I don't want to tread on things that are sacred to you. Remember when we kind of had that conversation? Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I just, I think, one of our hopes here is for Kajsa and me to dialogue and have personal connecting experiences, but also to hopefully model what hopefully can take place in your relationships with your near and dear ones as well. And reality is that there'll be pressure points and back-offs, and that's part of how life goes. And so to me it's a model of reality, so it's not a real problem. The only problem is when you stop talking. That's when it's a problem. You're going to say things, you're going to do things, you're going to challenge each other at times that you should do. For example, Kajsa wanted me to listen to John Dehlin's podcast with Patrick Mason, and they did 8 hours. It was in 3 parts, but they hadn't been talking to each other, and I'm not sure how well they knew each other before that. But
there had been some tension between the two of their interactions.
Anyway, and so they weren't talking to each other, and yet there was this intention or hope that someday they would, and so I think that's good. And they did it, and but
why was it, for those people that aren't aware of this conversation? Can you talk about why that was kind of a big deal?
Well, I think
for those following,
I think from what I'm not an expert on this, but maybe you should talk about it. You know more than I do, but I can give my perspective after you talk.
Yeah, real quick, I think it's important to point out that John Dehlin was excommunicated back in 2013, 2014.
Yeah, I think so.
Because of some of his advocacy and the way he was vocally speaking about issues that he saw with the church and other things. You can follow that whole story if you want to go down the rabbit hole. And now he is, his Mormon Stories podcast is huge, and he gets a lot of attention because he has a lot of detailed and passionate conversation with people and their experiences in the church, the good, the bad, the ugly. And he has definitely taken on a more pessimistic tone because a lot of what he's dealing with is the complicated issues that people don't want to talk about, have a hard time talking about. So the fact that he, a former insider, now an outsider, is engaging in these conversations, and Patrick Mason, a scholar, he has a PhD in U.S. history, he's up at Utah State, he's also dealing with these kind of things in Mormonism, not necessarily as a part of his career, but as an extracurricular, because he considers himself a true blue, in the faith, active Mormon, card-carrying Mormon, to use all the little spiels. And in the past, they definitely butt heads from their perspectives, and it's one of those things. It's a gap where John Dehlin's over here having dialogue, and Patrick Mason's over here having nuanced dialogue with people who are considered the faithful. And it seems to be like those who can listen and engage with John Dehlin are not the faithful. So we've got these two dialogues going on. Do they ever overlap? Are they ever going to go meet each other? And they did. So I didn't expect it to happen.
Well, I compare it to politics. It's kind of like when a president of the United States goes and dialogues with a leader from a communist country or something, or like a leader from Iran, that we pushed back on and say we're not going to talk with them, because to talk with them validates them in some way.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, so now here we have faithful religious scholar, Patrick Mason discussing with apostate John Dehlin, and that's anathema to both parties, both the outside parties who say, why would you talk with Patrick Mason? And the inside party saying, why would you talk to John Dehlin? So it was a big deal, and yet it was wonderful because they modeled the fact that Kajsa and I believe strongly in, that you have to keep the dialogue going. And I go back to the scriptures where the Lord said, come now, let us reason together. We are at variance with God. We all are. And it's through Christ that we're reconciled. We're brought back into a friendly relationship with Him. And God doesn't end the conversation. We do. We walk away from Him. But the scriptures in general show God pleading, wanting to plead with, talk to, calling out Israel, etc. So the conversation isn't ended on God's part.
And that's the power of the covenant.
Yeah.
To go back to the scriptures as he just brought up, the reason the covenant is powerful in the Old Testament and the New Testament in relation to Christ is because it's initiated by God.
Yeah.
It's a two-party arrangement.
Yeah.
But it's God's consistency that really makes it what it is.
Yeah.
And so that's the model.
Yeah.
It never stops.
Right.
Engaging.
It's the same thing with a marriage. I mean, successful marriages aren't marriages without problems. Successful marriages are marriages where people learn how to deal with the problems and navigate through them. And it's the same thing with successful families. They dial in and they work through challenges. So we ought to always be working towards that and examining ourselves and saying, what am I doing that's inhibiting the conversation? Do I need to listen more? Do I need to maybe change something? And so back to the Patrick Mason, John Dehlin conversation. The first session was basically a background on Patrick Mason. Who was he? Who is he? Where did he come from? What's his background? The second one was where the Dehlins, both John and his wife Margie, I believe her name is, asked Patrick Mason hard questions. The third session, they turned around and let Patrick Mason ask John Dehlin hard questions, and Patrick Mason actually called out John Dehlin on And so I'm tying this into Kajsa and my conversation, that sometimes we have to call each other out, if we use that phrase. I don't necessarily like that, but
hold each other accountable for your words.
Yeah, so you said this, now what do you mean by this? And I like that approach. Is you said this, what do you mean by this? Because sometimes we interpret things differently, and somebody might say something and we have a whole different interpretation of what they intended. So what's your intent? So go back to their words, and frankly, after what Patrick Mason did, it says, you said this, but in 2 weeks ago in your podcast you said this, and you said this and this, and after Patrick Mason pointed out these three things, there was quiet, and then John Dehlin said, basically guilty. Yeah. You're right. And then he talked about how sometimes he gets so full of passion that he doesn't even realize what he's saying, which is what
we all do it.
The trouble with spontaneous discussion. We do that, and that's okay. That's part of real human discussion. So with Kajsa and me, I may have said some things that I felt I needed to say, because I thought, now what are you trying to say here? I want to understand what are you saying, and so forth. And that may have challenged her a little bit, and I don't think that's wrong. I think it's essential, but we have to then, and thankfully Kajsa wanted to come back, and she actually shared that with me, and we could talk about it a little more and work through it a little bit, and that brought us back to where we're at today. So talk, people, talk. And if you need a little bit of space, Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 talks about the intimate relationship between a man and a woman. And he says, defraud not each other, meaning, I think Joe Smith translation rendered it as depart not one from another. Mm-hmm. But it's talking about the intimacy. Don't withhold from one another your sexual desires or passions or expressions as a weapon.
Your authentic self.
Yeah.
The real you.
Yeah.
So for those of you that were uncomfortable.
Yeah, he's using sexuality here, but
right.
I'm talking about intimacy.
Right.
And really
vulnerability.
Physical intimacy is only a part of it. There's the emotional intimacy. And so he says, don't depart from one another, except for a time that you might work through something or whatever, and come back together. So I love Paul's model that you're going to have, as with sexuality, as with intimate conversation, it's such that there may be times where something happens, you have to kind of distance each other from each other for a time. But Paul's counsel is not forever. Come back together. Right. That you can be more authentic when you come back together. And so I think we are. And that's where we're at. And maybe Kajsa and I made it to another level in our discussion and of our authenticity, which is important. Yeah,
and that also allows for more meaningful discussion. You probably noticed in the past we danced kind of around some things, or maybe don't go as deep as we could or should, and hopefully we can go those places. Yeah. Now, another thing I think is important is boundaries. As you engage in these conversations, sometimes when you point out what your boundaries are with the other person, that kind of communication allows for safety, safe talk. Just because you're having these real conversations does not mean anything goes. Mm-hmm. And I think I've heard so many people on the nuanced or exmo side talk regretfully about just vomiting out information to their true blue Mormon friends and family. That is not helpful. That was not asked for. And it's just, again, going back to it's not a helpful way to engage these things. And I believe you have to ask permission, consent. Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm feeling this way. Would you like to engage this? Mm-hmm. Or should we give it some space? Mm-hmm. That creates safety. And the feelings of anxiety that develop between the two communities, I think, develop partly because you never know what someone's going to say or bring up. But and it's not perfect, but if you've tried to kind of establish those boundaries and let people know where you're willing to go, where you're not willing to go, it helps a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great. Did you want to talk more about the Patrick Mason, John thing? First off, when I heard about this, I follow almost all the podcasts out there in the conversation world with Mormonism. The academic stuff, the more social stuff, the diatribes, the faithful apologetics. I try and keep aware of them. So when I saw this one come out, I knew it was a big deal because I know who John is and I know who Patrick is. And the very fact that you agreed to listen to it was awesome. I honestly didn't think my dad would. I didn't think he was going to just throw it back in my face, but I was like, I know kind of your feelings and thoughts on John Dehlin in the past, and I hold that space.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't going to push it, but the very fact that Patrick was on this discussion maybe provided a way for you to kind of be willing to listen to that content because of what you know of Patrick.
Yeah.
So I bravo,
And
because
I
know that wasn't easy.
Yeah. Actually, it was easy. It wasn't very hard at all.
Well, the conversation was great.
Let me say this, that if I can remember what to say. I think that but Patrick Mason, I believe his degree is in religious history, and he now is involved in Mormon studies at the Utah State, and he holds various chairs. So he's very much involved. It's not, you kind of made it sound like he's U.S. history and this
his theology stuff. His theology engagement is extra.
Well, theology is different than history, religious history.
Right, so he tries to keep them separate.
And he doesn't claim to be a theologian.
Correct. I think that was the point.
And in fact, he makes a great point about the difference between theology and history. He's a historian.
And the methods you use to
approach them. And I want to comment on that, because I think, in fact, as I listen to Patrick Mason and I are very similar in many ways. And I think sometimes people assume, like when a parent gives a direction to a child, the child interprets that very black and white and very narrowly. And I used the comparison with my wife the other day, that it's like the parent is like this giant reservoir of information, experience, and life. But what comes out in direction or commandment to the child is merely a bucket from that reservoir. And yet the child, all they have to deal with is the little bucket of water that came out of the reservoir. And so they make certain assumptions about what the parents believe, think, or want, and they may be totally wrong. All they have is this little bucket. And I think sometimes Kajsa says, my child has certain assumptions about what I will do, won't do, think, whatever, and she really has no idea of the reservoir of my life's experiences and knowledge, whatever. All she has to go by are whatever she's seen, witnessed, heard me speak, write, whatever. But that's not the totality of what I think and feel. And so for me to listen to John Dehlin and Patrick Mason, it's like, okay. And so I would just make that point. Now, back to this thing. I think it's interesting, and I really tried to analyze, how are these two people talking together? Why is Patrick Mason over here, and why is John Dehlin over here? And they do have some intersections, but there's a lot of difference between the two. And in fact, the thing that blew the Dehlins away was that Patrick Mason said, I've never had a faith crisis.
It blew me away.
I've never had one.
Yeah.
And, folks, I've never had one. And I don't consider myself naive. I've read, I've studied, I'm aware of the issues, but I haven't had a faith crisis. And I think something that at least I found is similar to Patrick Mason is that he kept going back to the Bible. He kept going back to the history of the Bible and the Bible itself as a reference point or a hermeneutic to use to view current church events. And I use this expression all the time, that make an appeal to the Bible. If you're having a challenge with something in the current church, we'll look at the ancient church, New Testament church, Old Testament church, and see if you can find parallels between this current challenge and those things that may give perspective to the current issue. Plus, he's a historian.
Right.
And so, two tools that Patrick Mason has used and does use to navigate the same cascades or rapids that John Dehlin navigates, but he doesn't have the same kind of tools, is his reliance on biblical precedent as well as history. And I think those, years ago I heard President Hinckley say, we ought to read more history. And that really hit me because I'm a historian. That's my background's in history. And I thought, way to go, President Hinckley. We ought to read more history, because I really believe that the more we understand history, the more we can take a current challenge and plug it into a broader perspective. It helps increase our perspective, and that's part of why I love family history, because family history allows us to take our current challenges and say, wait a minute. Like right now, I just transcribed a letter from my grandmother. She wrote to my grandfather. They're separated not because of love, but because of finances. He's down in San Francisco trying to get it, trying to work.
That'd be hard.
Grandma and the 3 kids are up in Hopeland, Washington, live with grandparents and trying to make things work. And my grandmother's love for Grandpa is clear in the letters she writes, but they're separated because of this economic challenge. And yet Grandma writes these in the midst of the Depression. This is 1932, keep in mind, folks, there's still another 10 years of Depression going into the war. And Grandma's optimistic, and yet she's realistic. She's saying this is hard, and she actually gives an accounting of their money and what they spent, and now they got set back $200. That's like $1 million.
Oh, yeah.
And yet Grandma says, we're going to make it through this. We're going to make it through this. And I think, wow, Grandma had lived through these experiences, and she had faith that they'd make it through, and they did make it through. And so as I watched my stock drop into the bear market and plummet, and $9 trillion or something's been lost, wealth's been lost in the last year or whatever.
We're not billionaires, just FYI.
Yeah, I didn't use $9 trillion to the company, but anyway, I say, okay, we're going to keep going on. We're going to make it through this, and so again, I think Patrick Mason's knowledge and appeal to history and biblical history, scripture, gives him an ability to navigate these challenging things in a way that John Dehlin did not have these tools. So I'd say, like President Hinckley said years ago, we got to study more history, particularly biblical history. And I would make it an appeal to the Bible, and I'll do that throughout our discussion. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
And I want to point out gently to push back on that, because I have listened to a lot more of John Dehlin than my father has. Yeah, his background's in psychology. He has a PhD in clinical psychology, so very different hermeneutics.
But before he experienced his or in the process, he was business.
Yeah, different field. That's right. That's right. Correct. Yeah. So whole different
background.
Perspective, background, and I think that definitely plays into one's the way you interact with religious crises or nuance or new information that can lead to a faith crisis. Mm-hmm. However, I think, and Patrick points out, and I think this is really important, that he did and still does in many ways live in a bubble of what's the word I'm looking for? Oh man, my brain's just not what it used to be when I was younger. Privilege. Thank you.
I think Margie pointed it out more than he did. She kept coming back.
Yeah, I thought Margie did it. I agreed with her, and it wasn't. When we say privilege, it's not an accusation.
Uh-huh.
Privilege helps you realize what you're coming into something with, your lived experience, and then a continuation of certain assets that play into your life. And in his case, his experience with Mormonism as a young adult was all very good, very ideal. He admitted that he wasn't even aware that the LGBTQ stuff was an issue in church social circles until 2016. That blew my mind, but I appreciated that he admitted that. He's like, because he was in the academic side of things and looking at certain things historically. So he was so occupied by that, and many people have agreed that college wards are the best wards to be in because it's full of thinkers and you've got people that hold space for each other. Well, he had been a part of that as he went from bachelor's to master's to PhD, and so he was kind of in his little bubble. And then when he started pulling out and looking around him, he started to realize not all was well in Zion. Whereas John Dehlin's been in the thick of it because of the dialogue he's had with people and his very own lived experience with queer children. So I think that that's something that's important to point out, and he does. And I really was grateful for Patrick to say that. Dad, you had mentioned you've never had a faith crisis, and I believe you, but you have, from my understanding, had moments where you've acquired new information and kind of gone. And I appreciated that you shared that with me over the years because it has helped me too. For example, I know, correct me if I'm wrong, when you were a new graduate student and you started really going deep into church history, early Christian history, you started to realize as you studied that and LDS history, the apostles didn't always agree with each other. Mm-hmm. And we see that in the early church, biblically a little bit more clearly than we do initially with the LDS Church. I know that was something that was hard for me to reconcile at my most active. And you admitted, like, yeah, what's going on? Why are the brethren not in agreement? Like, if we have this system of revelation, why is this happening? And then you move past it. You adjusted your worldview.
All the time. Yeah, I'd say, you know, I'm not the same man I was 40 years ago. I mean, 40 years ago, you can see by looking at me, I'm not the same man, but yeah, of course, you gain new information as you move along in life, new experiences, and you see other people's experiences, and so thankfully, I then use those to expand and learn and so forth. So
yeah, it's a great thing. Of course, you take that information and you adjust, and I think it also helps you flex a little bit and hold space for experiences that contradict your own, or your own assumptions. And it's helpful.
Yeah. Let me just interject there. That I was reading Isaiah. I was reading "Come Follow Me" this morning, Isaiah 50 through 57, I think it was. And there's always this fascinating statement where it says, "By his knowledge shall my servant justify many," or something like that. By his knowledge. And I actually had made a note in my scriptures years ago about that. And this by his knowledge, my righteous servant shall justify many. And then I thought about, and I won't go into the whole thing there, but I think knowledge is really, it's interesting that the KJV translators, and you go back and you look at what the original Hebrew is or whatever, but for whatever reason, the KJV translators use by his knowledge. But I think about the passage 121 of Doctrine and Covenants where it says that pure knowledge shall greatly expand thy soul. And I think that God is, he's omniscient, he's all knowledgeable. So here we have Christ, by his knowledge he's going to justify many. Here in the Doctrine and Covenants, but pure knowledge shall greatly expand thy soul. And God is all-knowing, and I think part of why God is so tolerant, because he is to use the Arabic, he is the most tolerant. You know, they use this in Arabic.
I have my Quran.
In Arabic they always use the superlative,
which is part of what makes the religion what it is.
Yeah, and so all these things for God, he's always the most in all these categories. Well, he is the most in knowledge, and therefore he's able to be the most in compassion. He's the most in mercy. He's the most in all these things. But knowledge is an essential element of that. And so the more we know about others, when we have pure knowledge about what's this wound that's in my daughter's heart that has caused this thing to break open in her life or somebody else's life or whatever. When we understand their situation, then we have pure knowledge. We may not be to the ultimate level yet, but the more pure knowledge of what's really going on, then the more compassion we have.
Right.
I see my little grandson the other day sitting, he was all mad because something happened, and I tried to talk to him. He hops over, he won't talk to me. Well, if I could just get inside his head and understand what's going on, then I'm able to render the appropriate love or whatever he needs in the moment. But I say, and so this is my segue to tolerance.
Okay.
God is the most tolerant. Joseph said he was more liberal than we have any concept of. He giveth to all men liberally. Well, God's a liberal, folks. Shocker. In that sense. And
that's a good one, Dad.
Yes. So,
I agree.
Yeah, so the more we have, the more we're compassionate, the more tolerant we are, and that's why mothers, they can look at their criminal son and say, he's not a monster. And yet he did monster things to somebody. And yet the mother says, there's more to that boy than what you know. And God knows this perfectly, not just in this life, but past life, future life. He's tolerant. And so I just got through reading in the Joseph Smith papers all these collections of his statements about religious tolerance and so forth. And I think, man, if we would apply that in our discussions on when somebody varies with us in religion or whatever, politics, whatever, we'd have a much more peaceful society. So I'm working on tolerance, and I want to hear what others have to say.
Beautiful. And I encourage you, viewers, as you are engaging with this content, shoot us an email, make a comment, ask a direct question to my dad or myself. We enjoy those things, and this probably can segue into some things I was going to say, if that's an okay time.
Yeah.
In regards to people connecting to things you're saying or your lived experience, and the way that we can buoy each other up. I also want to say I love what you were talking about in regards to, God's omniscient. So when God is dealing with his creation, I hate using his, her. I believe God is so much more than that. When God is dealing with their creation, that omniscience allows them that consistent love and compassion. And I remember when I was a missionary, that was one of the beautiful experiences that transformed me, was being able to see people and love them in this very compassionate way, simply because they were, right? The very fact that I knew that they were a child of God, one of God's creations, and I was also allowing that compassion for myself, radically changed the way I was able to engage people, the things I was able to tolerate and put up with, as I, all of our idiosyncrasies, my relationships to my companions. And that knowledge has forever blessed my life. When you start to see people, I always go back to some of my fascinations with Eastern philosophy or religious traditions. When you really see the divine in someone, you treat them differently.
Mm-hmm.
You hold space for them differently. You have patience, and there's humility in your dialogue with them, because the very fact that they are God's creation and you are God's creation demands respect and acknowledgement.
Absolutely.
That's a beautiful thing. And I've been around a few people in my life, thankfully, choice people, who have really demonstrated that. They see people that way, and they acknowledge that presence of the divine, and you feel special in their presence. Like, I want to be one of those people that helps people feel special in a very genuine way, just as they are, for being, right? For existing. So thank you for listening to my TED Talk there. Some of the things that we've been busy with this summer that I wanted to just hit on real fast. I was able to attend the Sunstone symposium. I've wanted to do this for years. I grew up, Dan Witherspoon coined the term a Sunstone child, and he said the Sunstone kids, the kids that grew up with Sunstone and Dialogue in their home, Dialogue being a publication, tend to jump into the nuance a little bit easier than those without, because of course these kind of conversations are being had in these spaces. And so for the first time I was able to attend, and not only attend, but I presented in two different sections. One on talking about a gendered God, and one on discussing why I stay in the church. And for those of you that are like, wait, Kajsa's in the church, I am still a member of the church, and I choose to connect with it, to involve myself with it, in ways that I feel safe, and I feel that I can authentically do that, and I pull back when I feel like I can't, and I talk about that. So that might raise some eyebrows, but that's my current situation. And it was a really productive session, specifically the why I stay. But afterwards, I had some couples come up to me, more your age, Dad, and it was really tender as they shared with me that they've been following these discussions, and there were tears in their eyes, and they just said, I just want to be able to talk to my child. And as a daughter, someone that in my experience, I really value that we can talk. It's not perfect, but it was as if I had my heart broke for them and their children, that there's been that gap in their lives, that distance, that chasm that has expanded to the point that they're not able to communicate over things that are very much embedded in their hearts. And the love that these parents have for their children, not being able to be communicated, and probably vice versa. So it was just touching, and it kind of spoke to the relevancy of what we're trying to do here. And so I hope that we can continue connecting with you all out there, wherever you are on this journey, to kind of help you feel like you're not alone. You're not alone. Other people are going through this, and it's very real. And when you address something, it takes away the power in ways that it's controlling your life, right? When we talk about these hard things, they suddenly don't seem as scary, as impossible, and experience leads, and that's a beautiful thing. Something that I've really enjoyed is the diversity of people I met at Sunstone. For me, my background, my undergrad was in cultural anthropology, It was an anthropologist's dream, meeting all these different people who were engaging Mormonism on their own terms in different ways. We had True Blue Mormons there, Temple Recommend Holding Mormons there. We had people that go for social reasons, don't believe in any of the theology. We had people that, engage on their own terms, and there were artists and there were comedians. It was just incredible. And one of the groups that I got to engage with that I really valued this experience was a polygamous group from Nevada. They have also branches in Utah County. They came and they spoke about the law of consecration and how they live it. And I have kind of recently been interested in gardening and plants, and I'm definitely still a learner. But it was really cool to hear their experience with how they use gardening to engage their communities, and the way that they interact with their livestock, same thing, to bless the community that they're a part of religiously, and just, whoever lives within their vicinity of influence or their sphere of influence. I think because there's so much stigma around the polygamous community in conservative LDS circles. For those of you that aren't aware, correct me if I'm wrong, Dad, but the Temple Recommend question, do you associate with or affiliate with anyone?
Support, agree with, so forth. It may be slightly different than that.
Yeah. Can you, anyone who, how does it go?
Yeah.
Who teaches something or supports something contrary
or opposes those of the church.
Right. So that question in the Temple Recommend interview process, my understanding is that question was created to kind of help identify those who were kind of leaving the mainstream LDS tradition and joining up with these polygamous groups. Is that? I had a stake president explain that to me once, so viewers, correct me if I'm wrong, because I jokingly said at one time when I was working at the University of Utah, well, I work for the University of Utah, and he laughed. He's like, well, that's not a problem. Let me explain to you why this question is what it is. So it's interesting that we still have that question, but regardless, I got to engage with some of these people who chose to break away and engage these doctrines, both men and women, young and old. As I was talking to my aunt the other day, she reminded me, you have an uncle who separated from the church and joined a polygamous group, the LeBaron clan. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Linda was saying
Church
that.
of the Firstborn.
Yeah, fascinating. So it's kind of close in our history as well. And I admit I have had prejudices against those communities for a very long time. I probably still do. That in many ways are incorrect and that I've had to repent of as I've slowly engaged them. In any community, there are abuses of power and authority, and specifically in religious communities. But it was really neat for me to hear specifically these polygamous women speak about their lifestyle, the things that they loved, the connections that they had with each other, with their families, and just hold space for them. That's not a lifestyle I'm going to pick or choose.
Yeah.
But these sisters, they were getting together and making 600 loaves of bread on the weekend to distribute out to the community. I love that.
Yeah.
Their youth groups, what they do mostly with activities, they get out in the fields and they weed and they distribute to the community, and I learned from them.
Yeah.
And also I love pickles, and a kind of a pejorative term for polygamous is the term plague, which I hate. And they boldly made fun of that term, and they were selling their pickles at Sunstone as pliggles. So I bought some, brought them home. They were delicious.
They're great.
Yeah, polygamous pickles, good stuff. So that was a really good experience.
Yeah, let me interject here. I go back to Christer Stendahl, a great Swedish theologian, and he has his various rules for engaging other religions, and one is that when you want to learn about another religion, go to that religion.
Yeah.
Don't listen to what others have to say about their religion. He says, if you do, most of what they say is more akin to the violation of the commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness, which is, there's a lot of truth to that. And so here Kajsa has had these assumptions where she's gotten from I don't know where. But
I know where I've gotten them.
Yeah.
I mean, our media, community,
Yeah.
it's a popular thing to jump on that bandwagon.
Yeah.
And some of the stories are true.
Yes, but when she actually engaged with them, she found that which was good and wholesome in many ways. And so, again, if we don't engage, we're going to vilify. We're going to ostracize. It causes them to become more marginalized. They marginalize
correct.
themselves to some degree.
They do
we
the same
marginalize
thing.
them.
That's right.
And we don't understand each other, and then we have these wars. We
And
have verbal wars, and then we have physical wars.
And I think that kind of dramatic example is the same thing that's happening in our communities, which is why we're doing this, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of fear around people who have pushed back or are discussing their doubts, their concerns. They, there's this idea that you're safer if you don't even go there. And to some extent, and in many cases, that is true. But real life is not black and white, right?
Yeah.
We would have no diplomacy if we weren't able to go a little farther, to cross a line maybe that you had been told your whole life. Don't cross. You and your experience with people in the Middle East. My dad's had some work experience where he's traveled to the Middle East and also as a student of Islam and Arabic. You've dealt with that. You've seen these inappropriate and wrong stereotypes, and you've lived the opposite. Do you want to talk about that?
No,
it's influenced me.
Yeah, absolutely. It just, it's like the old Mark Twain said, travel is lethal to prejudice or something like that.
Right,
and
right.
Yes, and I would say this: travel in time. Thus, go back to the Bible, go back to history, and don't go there with your 2020 clothes and judgments. Go back to 2000. Go back to the old times, and let them tell you how it was and how they felt about things and so forth, rather than you judge their culture and their time. So yeah, travel physically.
Well, I like that perspective.
Travel in
travel
history,
mentally. Get a book out and dive deep.
Stop judging and condemning everybody.
And I think at the same time, when we do find things that are abhorrent in the biblical text, I mean, let's get real. It happens, right?
Yeah.
Because this book is a conglomeration of history, poetry, narrative, some that's been more touched by hands than others. But when you start to recognize that, you can approach the Bible differently and Scripture in general. And it's a beautiful thing. It allows for different perspectives, which then reflect on, do we have more opportunity here than we realize?
Yeah.
More possibility. And I also just want to add, you get to the point where an appeal to the Bible seems, okay, let's do it. But we're still going to end up on opposite sides of the fences. I remember at graduate school kind of being shocked and a little dismayed that there's still disagreements at the highest level of inquiry, right? You've got people that can read the text and its original language, and they're still going to disagree with another person's interpretation. But the beauty is you're engaging it, and that keeps you humble.
Yeah, part of it is not necessarily to convince; it's just to help others understand your perspective.
I like that.
So
that you're coming from somewhere.
These are my assumptions that I'm going by, and as a Bible believer, I look at this, I see similar, so this is why I do what I do. And the person, okay, I can understand. If you accept that in the Bible, then I can understand how you can.
Or
accept
you read that certain way.
Yeah, that's,
because I consider myself a lover of the Bible and a follower of Jesus, but my path looks very different than my father's in some ways.
Yeah.
And I would like to think in public we're the same kind of folk. I don't know. Trying to do and be a good person.
Right.
So anyway, those are just some of our initial thoughts. We're doing this all in good time. I'm really excited for our continuous conversations because I think this is a really exciting time to be associated in any way with the church. And I do like the word Mormon. I know we've been asked not to use that. I respect people that want to hold to a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I guess as a youth, a lot of my rooted identity was developed during the I Am a Mormon campaign, and also Lindsay Hansen Park's big push, specifically at Sunstone, is this idea there's more than one way to Mormon. But really, when you think about it, everyone's relationship to God is individual because our needs are individual. So part of me thinks that's brilliant, but it should be a given, right? Because there's more than one way to live your life because you are different. I'm different than you. You're different than me. We have common ground. We have things that we're very different on. And that's okay. At least I feel like that's okay. And as I have been able to celebrate those differences, or at least hold space for them, I have been in some very sacred spaces from an intellectual perspective, as I've been able to listen to the stories of others and see their pain and their trials and their triumphs, and just hold space for that. Yeah.
So is this your segue into More Than One Way to Be a Mormon?
I don't think
she wrote me and said that's something she wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
And I kind of prepared to talk about it.
Yep.
So
Okay.
I'm ready.
Well, we have a good 10 minutes still.
So let's ask this question. So,
I don't even know if you want to say the word Mormon.
Yeah, I'll say the word Mormon.
Okay.
So I guess the question you have to ask is, what does it mean to be a Mormon? And it's going to be defined differently by different people. For me, I would say, you go ahead and say there's more than one way to be a Mormon. Well, we've been asked by the prophet to use the term Latter-day Saint.
Mm-hmm.
And so by that very, very challenge there, in a way we're separating ourselves from each other, because there's those that will say, prophet asked us to use the word Latter-day Saint, so I'm going to refer to myself as a Latter-day Saint. Well, there's a group of people that either because for whatever reason, they're going to continue to use the word Mormon. Well, already there's a separation.
Sure.
There's a separation.
Sure.
And so...
So what do we do with that?
Well, no, it's just, I guess, who defines what it means to be a Latter-day Saint? Who defines what it means to be a Mormon? Well, I go to Wikipedia and I looked up 4 terms. Jew.
I was actually just going to launch into the Judaism thing. Okay.
Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And Wikipedia.
That's 3 terms. You said 4.
3? Well, yeah. I'm getting 4.
Oh, okay.
Jew, Christian, Muslim, and I put it in that order because chronologically that's how they develop. And then Latter-day Saint.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's 4th term, and they have their definitions, and so it's interesting to see how Wikipedia, and I'm not saying that's necessarily the authoritative source, but it's a common source that's kind of out there, and people speak to it. So it defines what a Jew is, it defines what a Christian is, what a Muslim is, and then it defines what a Latter-day Saint is, and it says in the thing that also sometimes known as Mormon. And so you've got these definitions of what it, from at least that perspective, what it means to be that.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, there's some very clear criteria that are given for what it constitutes being one of those things, one of those faiths. I also looked up what it was a Catholic, and I did that because I think when you talk about within Christianity, Latter-day Saints and Catholics are very similar in the sense of their
some of their theological views on authority.
Well, we have Pope, we have Prophet,
mm-hmm.
and the Pope in a way kind of is the person who's stating what it means to be a Catholic, and the Prophet in a way is kind of stating what it means to be a Latter-day Saint.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then you can, if you go back to Judaism, which is the oldest of those in historical sense, there's a much broader, perhaps, spectrum of what it means to be a Jew.
Yeah.
There's all these different Judaisms.
We've got millennia behind those traditions.
So you have Judaisms.
Yes.
But the difference between Judaism and non-Catholic Christianity, I'm simplifying it, is that there's no central leadership. There's no there's no recognized head of those religions.
Right. They have their appeals, right?
Yeah.
To Talmudic tradition and whatnot, but they allow for variation.
Because there's no head.
Mm-hmm.
There's no one leader per se.
Right.
Catholicism there is. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints there is, and so it's a little challenging, and I just say as you have this discussion, you have to consider it in this light, because while there may be many Judaisms, because there is no central authority, can there also be many Mormonisms when you do have a central authority?
That's a great question.
And I'd say historically, and from strictly that perspective, no, you can't, because you have a particular person who's seen as the head of that organization, who defines what it means to be a part of that organization. And so the very fact that you have central authority makes that a little challenging. And then so that's one perspective. The other one is okay, you go ahead and be a Mormon, but we're going to be called Latter-day Saints.
I thought about that.
And we're going to
this
be more
distinction between the Mormons and Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, so if you want to keep calling yourself a Mormon, I guess you can do that. But the prophets asked us, or members, to use this term. Not to shun the other necessarily.
No, yeah,
we use it in
it's
Mormon
a shift
studies
in
and we
culture.
recognize that we've used it, but he's asked us to use that term. And so by simply following the prophet, those who choose to continue to call themselves Mormons are separating themselves from the body that is now called the Latter-day Saints. And so, I guess there are more than one way to be a Mormon, but there's only one way to be a Latter-day Saint. I'm simplifying it.
No, I get it. And that's actually really funny, tying back to, I mean, I don't want to make this too long, but I feel like we could really, maybe we'll continue on. But when I was at Sunstone, I was having a conversation with one of the polygamous elders, and I had noticed this group was a little more liberal, but I had noticed, the only thing that I noticed about all of them is they were all wearing long sleeves and long pants or skirts. They didn't kind of have like the funky, puffy braids and like the uniform dresses that you think of when you think of like Warren Jeffs. But I said, I'm assuming the reason you're wearing long sleeves is because your garment, you adhere to the original style of the garment that goes all the way down to your wrists. And he looked at me and he said, no, we don't adhere to the original garment. We adhere to the garment, to the priesthood garment. And I was like, I see what you're doing. He and I were very friendly. I chuckled and I said, touche, fair enough, right? And in his view, there's only one way to wear the garment, which was as originally revealed. And the ties at the very end of these garments that take you all the way down to your arm are significant to them, just as the markings are significant to garment-wearing Latter-day Saints. The tie is just as significant. And so the very fact that we've taken that out in mainstream Mormonism is heretical to them. It's fascinating, or it's an apostate act. That being said, I think you're starting to see Mormons or Latter-day Saints, I think we can use both. You know, for example, I was very aware when the shift from Mormon to Latter-day Saint happened because of the strong tensions between the teachings behind those things. And I think you know what I'm referring to in regards to President Hinckley, who said, be a Mormon, dare to be a Mormon, be proud, right? Some may say that this is a derogatory thing or it doesn't help the church, but I say it's a beautiful thing. And he really pushed that campaign. And when we had another prophet, 2 prophets later, boldly say that doing those things is a victory for Satan, it creates some cognitive dissonance in what it means to follow the prophet. And when we also have historically prophets saying, do your research, pray about these things, don't just follow blindly, or just because the prophet says something, you don't have to jump to it. You could also say that is, as the gentleman who said, no, we wear the garment. I could say, no, I am following the prophet, because the prophets vary on what they said. And I know how you would respond to that. You'd say, well, we focus on a living prophet. But when these words are as bold as victory for Satan, it does make you want to look at the nuance a little more deeply, as I do, and make these decisions for myself. And also I would say, you know, what makes a Mormon? I know for me, yes, we talk about agency, and children are given the choice to be baptized. But there's no way I would have been baptized had I not been influenced by parents and community who prepared me for that. It's not possible. A child isn't going to stumble upon Mormonism on their own, rarely. And so, to some extent, as I was initiated in this community, there comes a point where you claim it for yourself for whatever it is. And are we holding space for that, you know? Because if being a Mormon means, or being a Latter-day Saint means following the prophet, I suppose I get it. I totally get it, and it makes sense to me theologically. But socially, that seems like a very unwise decision, because to what extent do we draw that line then?
What do you say is an unwise decision?
Because, did you say why?
What is the unwise decision? I'm not sure.
To define Mormonism, those who are Mormons or Latter-day Saints, as those who follow the prophet, I get it. Theologically, it makes sense. But socially, I think it's dangerous because it forces our hand at drawing a line in the sand. Then I should be excommunicated.
Yeah. Well,
do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, where do we...
Yeah.
I don't know.
I guess the question
we could chew on this for hours.
Well, no, the question is to me is, you're talking about two different definitions. My definition, someone else's definition.
Okay.
The prophets or whatever else. So it's, what do you consider yourself? And you can consider yourself whatever you want.
Right. There's the extremes to this perspective.
That's so I go back to Christianity. I mean, Christianity, initially, Jesus made this statement. And I think this is really important. I think we have to really take this seriously. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 40, this is all Jesus' teachings to his newly called apostles. He's talking to them. He's telling them how they're going to, this is best information we have about how the apostles are going to do their work. He says, he that receiveth you, speaking to his 12, receiveth me. And he that receiveth me, receiveth him that sent me. So if we take that statement and we really, really take it seriously, Jesus is saying, if people receive you, they will receive me. These are his apostles. Mm-hmm. Now, from a Latter-day Saint perspective, those apostles are constituted and upon the earth today in the restoration. So we would take that as an act of Latter-day Saint and say, if you receive the 12 apostles of the Lord today, you will receive Jesus Christ. You will be called by his name. You will be his followers. And theologians or whatever can say, well, that only meant those 12 in Jesus' time.
I mean, that's my brain was going to that direction.
Go back to early Christianity, and you had the apostles. One died, they had to fill his place. So they felt it was important to maintain that 12 apostle quorum.
Right.
And, we could go back and talk about the early history of the church, whatever. But at some point, Catholicism believes they're a continuation of that original people. And I would think they would have a very dogmatic interpretation of this passage and what it means to them today.
Certainly, they would.
Now,
agreed.
And the schism between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, and later on the Protestant Revolution, protestation. There would be a time when their Catholics would have said, "You're not truly Catholic. You're not truly
part of this universal
original thing."
Yes.
Now, where Christianity is at on that today, I don't know, but there certainly was a time when that they would say, "You're not part of Christ's church."
Well, and that didn't go so well.
Yeah. So
inquisitions, excommunications, burning people at the stake. I guess from a historical perspective, I'm like, we can learn what being dogmatic looked like then. Yeah. So
again, we got to go back to and everybody is going to have to figure out what that means to themselves. You go ahead and figure it out. Yeah. And so I'm using that model to kind of get to the church today and say, if this is interpreted by, I follow President Nelson, I'm being received by Christ, I'm still a part of his congregation. I think I have full confidence that President Nelson was inspired to do what he did, and I think as time goes on, if you want to be called a Latter-day Saint, if you want to be a part of the Church of Jesus Christ, the Latter-day Saints, you will hold to those things.
Conform.
Conform to what we're being asked to do and say the temple recommend questions. And there may be others that are doing that to some degree or less degree. This goes back to our original conversation months ago where we talked about what does it mean to be in the house.
All in.
Yeah, all in. No, you don't have to be all in, but you may not receive all the blessings that one would receive from, for example, I think I'm going to receive certain blessings by the fact that I consciously have chosen to follow the prophet and refer to myself as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think there are certain blessings that will come with that and that have come with that. And this body of people who choose to do that and continue to follow what the current living prophet says will continue. And there'll be other groups here who will take pieces and bits of that and culturally or whatever and they'll be blessed by those portions that they feel are true and follow and generally are true principles. That doesn't mean they are totally not profiting from it, but they may not receive all of it. So I'm not going to argue with somebody about whether they're a member of the church.
It's just funky how it's
not.
such a hot topic.
Yeah,
you know?
it is.
It became a hot topic, I believe, when President Nelson used that phrase, "a victory for Satan."
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't think it would have been.
Yeah.
And like you said, I can totally get on board with that was an inspired shift. But then when you use such passionate wording around that, they kind of, especially when Hinckley was so much in the other direction, it gives a lot
I
to
wouldn't
discuss.
say he was so much in the other direction. You go back and study his talk, and he said, we don't particularly like this. We're going to do the best we can with it.
No, I think I'll stick to my words, though.
Well, go ahead.
We can do it in the next. I mean,
you stick your words. He talked about it. He addressed it. He says
because President Nelson had given this idea out at General Conference more than once.
He had,
and President Hinckley always kind of seemed to follow up with, "No."
Yeah. Again, we if you want to follow it, we can.
Yeah,
but
it's already.
I said we're going to do what we can with it, and he gave his talk on the more good talk and so forth. So he says let's make it happen. For people,
well, and he was a centrist. He was kind of a.
Yeah, he says if people are going to call us that, let's take it and do the best we can with it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Anyway, so I guess what does it mean? Here's the
we
question.
We got to wrap it up.
Here's the real
Sorry,
question.
guys. Okay.
What does it mean to be a Mormon? You can talk about that all day long. What does it mean to be a Latter-day Saint? And are you folks that are struggling with using the word or following the prophet or whatever? I'm not being negative here. Are you willing to jump with us and be a Latter-day Saint, or you still want to be a Mormon?
Yeah,
and it's going to change.
And I guess
and 10 years from now, we're going to look different than we do today.
To me, I would say I'm not concerned about those things. First and foremost, I'm concerned about being a disciple of Jesus.
Absolutely.
Nomenclature beyond that doesn't concern me, and I feel like it's wasted time and energy. So that's all I would say. But we can continue. I'm really glad to be back doing this, Dad.
Yeah.
I love you, and I love this engagement, guys. It's about the wrestle, and we've got a lot of wrestling to do in our community, but I have hope that things can get better. But it really starts with you and your own relationship. So first and foremost, I think reinforce love, right? Like we've had some very tender moments where before we've been able to even go into these sensitive topics, we've had to reinforce love. Like, hey, look, this is hard. I love you. Like, I'm here for this. And if you can't start with that, then that's really where you got to start working on. So let your family and friends know you love them, you value them, and you wanna make things better. So, any closing thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a great thing. And he loves a big word. Love encompasses trust. It encompasses compassion. It encompasses tolerance. I love Paul's definition that we find in Corinthians, and it's expanded there in the Book of Mormon of charity with, I think there's 13 different attributes associated when we talk about charity, the pure love of Christ. You can talk about love, but let's break it down and let's study Paul's words and say, what does love really mean?
By this shall men know ye are my disciples, if you have love one to another. So, thanks, everyone. Till next time.
Okay.
Bye.